Hi everyone, my name is Haro and I do videos on YouTube about video editing, shooting and coloring. In today's video I want to talk about a topic that it's been driving me a little bit crazy, and it's very simple. I've been trying to find a video on YouTube that it talks about the difference of C-Log and C-Log 3 on the new Canon cameras. And sure, you will find some videos on YouTube talking about these two different color profiles, but the truth is none of them actually show real examples, properly shot, and the real differences between these two color profiles. For those who don't know, C-Log is a video color profile that allows you to maximize the dynamic range of your camera. And basically the dynamic range is the amount of highlights and shadows that your camera can capture in one shot. So that is why I decided to come here. The sun is setting, we have a lot of harsh light right now, so it's gonna be very interesting to see how C-Log versus C-Log 3 performs. We will be able to see the amount of highlight and shadow that my camera, the Canon EOS R6, is able to retain. And since I'm doing this comparison between C-Log and C-Log 3, I decided that I also wanted to add another layer and use a functionality that I never use in my camera because as filmmakers we kind of hate, that it's the HDR mode. The HDR mode works differently than the regular log profiles. And what it does is to take two images, one capturing the highlights and one capturing the shadows, and combine both of them. The only problem with this mode, and that's why we never want to use it, is that doesn't allow for a lot of color correction. All the colors come straight out of the camera baked, and there's a lot of saturation. So the other reason I really wanted to do this video is because since Canon launched their latest firmware that it allowed to introduce C-Log 3 on our cameras, I started shooting only in C-Log 3. Now I have a cinema camera myself, and I always use C-Log 3 in that one, and the color grading process is just really nice. But with this camera, I started using C-Log 3 and I've noticed that there was so much grain in the darker areas. And I really didn't like that. So what I did is I switched back to the C-Log original, the C-Log 1, and I started using that one, and I realized I kind of like more how the colors came out. But then I kept thinking, how am I using the old C-Log version if Canon is saying that has one less stop of dynamic range? It just doesn't make sense. I should be using C-Log 3. And why C-Log 3 has more grain constantly all the time? So this is what I want to show you guys. I want to record C-Log video, C-Log 3 video, compare both of them, see the dynamic ranges, and come with a proper conclusion so I can figure out which one I want to use moving forward. Let's go. Now I captured all the images. Let's go home and see how all this footage looks in DaVinci Resolve. I want to see the histograms, the vectorscopes, see what's clipping, what's not, and maybe I can finally know whether if I should be shooting in C-Log, C-Log 3 or HDR, but I don't think so. Let's go. Okay, we're back. So the first thing I'm going to do is open DaVinci Resolve, and I'm gonna bring all the clips, the C-Log, C-Log 3 and the HDR, and we're gonna see the difference between them. So let's open DaVinci Resolve. So let's start by going into the color tab. So the way I organize this is that the first clip is the one that I shot on C-Log 1 with ISO 400, that is the native for C-Log. The second clip is C-Log 3, but I kept the ISO at 400. Now, why did I do that? Well, Canon recommends that when we're shooting in C-Log 3, we always keep it at ISO native of 800. But I was wondering, what happens if I actually bring the ISO a little bit lower? Because I want to reduce that grain. So that's why I shot the C-Log 3 with ISO 400. When we do that, we get that little L on the camera telling us that that's expanded ISO. And Canon says that if we use an ISO below the native recommended for the log profile, we're gonna get less dynamic range. Well, let's see what happens. Let's check out this first clip. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So what I did when I was shooting these clips is most of them I actually overexposed them in order to see how much highlight the camera was able to retain. So you will see a bunch of clips that they're actually very overexposed. But by doing it this way, we will see how much highlight each profile is retaining. So this first shot is the C-Log 1 ISO 400. As we can see here, already like all these areas gone. So the first thing I'm gonna do is show scopes. And I usually only use the parade and the waveform. Basically the parade shows you at what point that your whites are clipping and at what point your blacks are clipping down here. So 0 would be the blacks are clipping, and then 1023 basically your whites are gone. There's no detail there. So as we can see, we have already a part here that is clipping, and that will be this entire area, right? That's fine. Okay, now that we've seen this one, let's go and check. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to right click and grab still. All this footage is not color graded, by the way. Grab still, and we have the still of C-Log 1. Now what I can do is come here, and this is the C-Log 3 with 400 ISO. So basically, according to Canon, this would have less dynamic range than C-Log 3 with 800 ISO. So if I click here and I go into show reference wipe, what's going to happen is we will see the difference between these two shots. And in case you're wondering how did I match the exposure of every one of these shots, it wasn't very accurate because I didn't have a monitor with me, so I couldn't use false color or the actual parade. That is just the best way to do it. What I used were the zebras. So I matched exactly the same exposure by looking at the zebras. Now, if I click on to show reference wipe, what I can see here is that this one on the right, this is the Canon C-Log 3 with 400 ISO. And this one right here is the Canon C-Log 1. You can see right away that C-Log 1 has less detail. If we look at this part right here, we're gonna see that we have a little bit more detail in the C-Log 3. Can you guys see it? We can see a little bit more detail here in the shadows than here, that it's like burnt and completely gone. So that's fine. We knew that C-Log 1 has less dynamic range, therefore, so far, so good. So what I'm gonna do now is compare this same shot with the C-Log 3 with 800 native ISO. And this is the one. By the way, because I had an ND filter, you can clearly see that we have this like cyan blue tone to it. That's a little bit unfortunate, but this is how it came out. Now, let's compare this one to the C-Log 1. And putting aside the fact that the ND kind of like messed up the hue on this shot, we can clearly see, look at the sun. This is using the same exposure, according to my camera. Look at the sun only. The amount of detail is already much bigger, right? Only this part has much more detail. So clearly, C-Log 3 is retaining much more detail on the highlights. But what I'm gonna do right now also is, where I was really curious to know is if that C-Log 3 400 ISO was very different than C-Log 3 800 ISO. I'm gonna grab a still, right, this one right here. This still is C-Log 3 400 ISO and compare it to the 800 ISO. So this is 800 ISO. And let's see reference wipe. And as you can see, there's already a big difference. You can already see the amount of detail that we have between 800 ISO C-Log 3 and 400 ISO C-Log 3. So there's already a big difference right here. So only with this first example, I can see already the dynamic range that the camera is offering. And as I mentioned, I also shot in HDR, even though I don't know who shoots in HDR because it's just horrible. But there you guys have it. This is the HDR. As you can see, it's completely clipped, very saturated, and very contrasty. Even comparing this one to, let's say we want to compare it to, let's compare it to C-Log 1, show reference wipe, and we can see the difference. There's no chance I would ever use this profile. It just comes very contrasty, all the colors are already baked in, and there's not much room for editing. Look at the highlights here, already more blown out. So even though I wanted to add this HDR mode in the whole comparison, it doesn't really make much sense. Now for some people it might be useful. Why? Because if you don't have a lot of time to color grade, HDR is much quicker and faster. But in my opinion, the footage just comes out very crappy looking. Okay, so let's check another example now. So for this second example, I really didn't overexpose. I kind of wanted to expose normally in a way that would look good. This is C-Log 1, and I already did a little color correction on this. Basically, I brought down the shadows and I brought up the highlights. I'm just gonna do it so you guys can see it. But what I basically did, as you can see here in the waveform, I brought the gain all the way up, almost right about clipping. I usually don't color grade like this. My highlights the high, but for this example, and I brought this down. And I did the same with the other options, C-Log 3 400, C-Log 3 800, and well, we're not gonna talk about this one because this is the HDR again, and it just looks so bad. If we look at these three examples, I don't really see a big difference. But if I zoom in into the darker areas, that's when maybe we're gonna see something. So let's go into C-Log 1. And what I'm going to do is zoom in at a dark spot. For example, this rock right here. And I'm gonna zoom in a lot, so bear with me because there's gonna be very pixelated. So maybe this dark area right here, it's a good spot to compare. So if I play this is C-Log 1. And I don't see a lot of noise here. Let's check out now C-Log 3 with 800 ISO. That is the way that you should be shooting it. If I zoom here a little bit also, let's make sure we're in the same spot. Yeah, we are. I don't know if you guys can see, but there's a lot of noise here. Much more compared to here. As you can see, so since this shot wasn't overexposed and it was properly exposed, and we didn't have a lot of bright highlights and very dark shadows, in this case right here, I think the shadows look better on C-Log 1, just because C-Log 3 native ISO is 800, and then we get more grain. Let's look at another example, this one right here. So in this case again, I was testing the highlights, and I really did overexpose this shot. As you can see, I actually exposed for her, and the whole thing was overexposed by 3 stops. So this first shot right here was the one shot on C-Log 1. As you can see, all this part here is already baked and burnt. If we look at the parade, clearly all this part is clipping and burnt. Let's check on the C-Log 3 400 ISO. What do we see here? Oof, this is still very burnt. But now, the highlights are clipping not all the way up, so somehow the Canon camera decides to clip them earlier, but they're still clipped. So as you can see the difference between this shot and this shot, I don't know what to tell you. I feel like the C-Log 1 is actually better than the C-Log 3 with 400 ISO. But if we look at the C-Log 3 800 ISO, that's when we see a difference. Okay, so let me just grab a still of C-Log 1. Grab still. So now I have a still of C-Log 1, and what I'm going to do is compare it to C-Log 3 800 ISO. And if we show reference wipe, here we have the difference. You can clearly see the extra stop of dynamic range that Canon claims C-Log 3 has. This is exactly the same exposure. So as you can see right here, if we look at these highlights, burn highlights, this is C-Log 1 and C-Log 3. So basically, we're getting much more highlights again. Very easy to see. So in this case, in a case that is very bright outside, I would totally suggest to use C-Log 3. Okay, so let's check out another example. After checking the highlights, what I wanted to check was more on the shadow side of it. So I waited until the sun set to just see how the camera was capturing the shadows between C-Log and C-Log 3. So in this example, this is C-Log 1. And as you can see, I actually clipped a little bit the highlights here. And my shadows are pretty much a little bit more than 128. And now let's check that. Let's compare that to the C-Log 3 800 ISO, that is the native. That is the important one, the one that we should be utilizing in order to get all the dynamic range. This is C-Log 3 with 800 ISO. As you can see, we're almost clipping here, but we're not. We're very, very close. So if I show the wipe of C-Log 1, then we get those highlights clipping. As you can see, the waveform, if you look at the waveform right here, the waveform, it's pretty similar. The difference is that in C-Log 3, our shadows and midtones are a little bit more lifted. That's why we're getting more noise. So here my question is, what if I was gonna grade this shot in particular? How would the shadows react? So let's do it. I'm just gonna grade the C-Log 1, and I'm just gonna pretty much only bring the shadows, lift, and I'm gonna bring them all the way almost to the bottom. Again, I usually don't do that much because I like to get my blacks a little bit milky. Let's do something like that, and I'm just gonna add a little bit of saturation just for the sake of this edit, and I'm gonna put it at, let's say, 60. Okay, so now let's do the same with C-Log 3 800 ISO. Let's do the same, bring this down almost all the way to 0. And I'm gonna add the same kind of contrast, the same saturation, 60. And now what I want to do is I want to zoom in into these shadows. And I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna zoom into their jacket, his jacket. Okay, let's see how these darks are playing here. Okay, the amount of noise is decent, it's not too bad. Let's see the same thing on C-Log 1. But actually, if I zoom right here, now I'm zooming in a lot, guys. So we can see all this noise. I don't know if in YouTube you'll be able to see, but here there's clearly more noise. So again, same thing. We're getting more noise in C-Log 3. As I said, for some reason I've been liking more the C-Log 1 than the C-Log 3, even though the C-Log 3 is giving me this extra one stop of dynamic range. When I shoot a little bit underexposed or in a low light situation, it handles the shadows better with less noise. The next shot you're going to see, I went a little bit extreme on that, and I shot a very underexposed scene when the sun was already set. So let's have a look at it. So this first shot again is C-Log 1, and as you can see, if I go even full screen, it's very underexposed. This is again not color graded, and we barely have detail in all this bottom part. I did that on purpose, I did underexpose it, so we would be able to see how our C-Log handling the shadows. I'm gonna do a little grade so we can see how the shadows react. If I go and zoom in here in the shadow area, for example around here, this is the noise I'm getting with C-Log 1. It is not that noticeable. C-Log 3, you can clearly see much more noise. And that's the reason why every time I've been shooting with C-Log 3 and it's a little bit underexposed, I don't really like it because it's hard to get rid of this noise. And I just prefer to go into C-Log 1, sacrifice one stop of dynamic range, and get a cleaner image. If you go and check my short film called Thankful, I actually shot the entire film in C-Log 1. And what I like about that look is that C-Log 1 actually clips the blacks a little bit more, but they look cleaner. So yes, we're losing a little bit of detail on the blacks, but they get cleaner. And I kind of like this a little bit faded look on the blacks, as long as it comes natural. If you push too much this milky, faded look in post-production, it's gonna look so bad. It's gonna look like it's from 2015 when everyone was just doing that cool fade look that it's just not cool anymore. But if it comes out of the camera like that, it feels much more natural. So in that short film, if you check it out, you'll see that the blacks are actually a little bit clipped, but they look very nice, they look very pleasant to the eye. And even in this shot that it was a little bit underexposed, I think it looks much better than if I would have shot it in C-Log 3 and I would have get all that grain. And in case you were wondering, this is the HDR mode. It actually doesn't look that bad. When it comes to noise, it's actually not that bad. And it looks already kind of color graded, right? So in this case, maybe the HDR did a decent job. So yesterday when I was done shooting all that, I was thinking I kind of want to have an extra shot where I can compare like highlights and shadows at the same time. Situations where there's a lot of dynamic range. So that's why I get an extra shot of here inside my apartment to be able to see how C-Log 1 versus C-Log 3 would work when there's like situations with a lot of dynamic range. In this case, I actually exposed for the outside, so I was really pushing the shadows inside. I really wanted to see this difference again. Let's zoom in onto this area right here of the couch. This is C-Log 1. You guys can see this noise. There's a quite amount of noise that if we go into C-Log 1, we don't get. So to recap a little bit, after doing all these tests, what are the things that I've learned that I actually didn't know? First of all, C-Log 3 has a better dynamic range. This we know, Canon told us, so we agree on that. C-Log 3 shooting underexposed gets more grain than C-Log 1. Okay, I understand that ISO is 800, so this is the logical thing to happen, that it has more noise. The other conclusion I got after doing this test is that using C-Log 3 with expanded ISO of 400, for example, that basically means using less ISO than the Canon recommends, is actually not a good idea, because you're not utilizing the whole dynamic range that your camera can capture. And HDR mode, I included in there, but I don't know, if you guys want to go ahead and use it, up to you. If you are lazy to color grade, then sure, I guess it'll work for you, but it's clearly a mode that I will never use. It just comes all crunch, it doesn't give you any flexibility to color grade, and it just looks kind of bad to me. What am I going to do moving forward? I still really like C-Log 1. I just like how the shadows come a little bit milky, maybe less detail, but less grainy, less noisy. I like that, and I like how it's very easy to color grade, and I really like how the colors come straight off the camera. C-Log 3 feels that needs a little bit more of maintenance, meaning you have to spend more time color grading. The colors come out a little bit more flat, so you have to like do more color correction to get them correctly. And don't use C-Log 3 in an underexposed situation. I think the shadows get very, very noisy, and in my opinion, it's not worth it. Now, if you're in a situation that you have a lot of brightness coming in, it's very bright, or if you're in a studio situation where the light is perfectly controlled and you have a perfect exposure, then I would go for C-Log 3, because C-Log 3 is going to give you more dynamic range. So yeah, after watching all these random videos on YouTube talking about these two profiles, everyone was saying, use C-Log 3, use C-Log 3, use C-Log 3, and I kept thinking like, why they keep saying this if it's so noisy? But now I understand how I can work with C-Log 3 in a way that it's not going to get noisy. And that is always when I have a better lighting situation. So moving forward, as I said, I will continue to use C-Log 1, even though I lose one stop of dynamic range. Sometimes it's not bad to clip the highlights. Right now, I'm kind of like clipping a little bit in this area, the highlights, and that's okay, that's fine, you can totally do that. I think C-Log 1 has a nice roll-off, so if you clip highlights, it doesn't look bad at all. So this was a good test for me also to know if I'm shooting C-Log 3 and I'm like, oh, I want to bring that ISO down. Now I know that if I do, I can do it, but I will reduce the dynamic range. So I hope this test was helpful for you guys. I actually wanted to do a test to help a little bit the community to see the differences between C-Log 1 and C-Log 3. I think this test kind of helps to decide whether you should be shooting on C-Log or C-Log 3, if you're shooting your R5 or your R6. And let me know what you think in the comments. Do you guys shoot on C-Log or do you guys shoot on C-Log 3? And if you guys shoot on C-Log 3, how are you dealing with the shadows? Do you always overexpose to get rid of them? And how about when you're in an underexposed situation? Do you still shoot C-Log 3? Do you get that noise? And that's it for today's video. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It actually helps me a lot to grow on YouTube. And if you like this kind of content, just hit subscribe. And I'll see you guys very soon. Yeah, I'm clipping a little bit there. Let's adjust this. And no more clipping. But now guess what? I'm underexposed. Oh well.